Wyoming Territory, June 1879. The train shuddered to a stop at the weathered platform of Willow Creek, its brakes screeching like a banshee across the open plains. Dust swirled in the late spring air, catching the sunlight in a haze that made the small town look like a painting. Left too long in the sun, Eleanor Grayson stepped off the final passenger car, her boots touching the splintered wood of the platform, with a hesitancy that mirrored the tremor in her chest. She wore a faded lavender dress, its hem frayed from the long journey from Pennsylvania, and clutched a worn valise as if it were the only thing tethering her to the world she'd left behind. Her eyes scanned the sparse crowd, searching for the man who had promised her a future, but the air felt heavy with something she couldn't yet name. The platform was a bustle of activity-men in sweat-stained shirts unloading crates, a woman herding the children toward a waiting wagon, a dog barking at the steam hissing from the locomotive. Eleanor's gaze settled on a group of four men standing near a stack of barrels, their laughter sharp and careless. The tallest among them, with a lean frame and a hat tilted low, was Samuel Carver, the man who had written her letters filled with dreams of a homestead, a partnership, a life. She'd read those letters until the paper wore thin, each word a brick in the foundation of the life she'd imagined. But as she approached, her steps slowed. Samuel's eyes met hers, and instead of warmth, there was a glint of amusement that made her stomach twist. "Is that her?" one of the men asked, nudging Samuel with an elbow. His voice carried over the platform, loud enough to draw curious glances. Samuel tipped his hat back, his gaze raking over Eleanor from her scuffed boots to the bonnet she'd tied too tightly under her chin. Then he let fade a short, barking sound that hit her like a slap. "Good Lord, she looks like she wandered out of a sewing circle," he said, his words dripping with mockery. The other men joined in, their laughter a chorus that echoed in her ears. Eleanor's throat tightened, her fingers gripping the valise until her knuckles whitened. "Samuel," she said, her voice barely audible over the fading hiss of the train. You're here for me, aren't you?" He smirked, crossing his arms. "You really came all this way? For what?" He gestured at her dismissively, as if she were a stray dog that had followed him home. "Those letters? That was a lark, sweetheart. A bet with the boys here. You didn't think I'd actually marry some spinster I never laid eyes on, did you?" The air around her seemed to still, the world narrowing to the sting of his words. The platform, the people, the distant clatter of the train of it faded as humiliation burned through her. She'd sold her late father's pocket watch, her mother's silver locket, everything she owned to buy the ticket west. The letters had been her lifeline, their promises of a shared life pulling her through the grief of losing her family, to fever to winters past. She'd memorized every line, every assurance of a home, a hearth, a husband. Now, those words crumbled like ash. Samuel turned away, still chuckling, his boots kicking up dust as he and his friends sauntered toward the saloon across the street. The crowd parted around them, some casting pitying looks at Eleanor, others pretending not to see. She stood rooted to the platform, her valise heavy in her hands, her breath shallow and sharp. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to let them fall where anyone could see. A few yards away, a man in a weathered duster coat stepped forward from the shadow of a nearby wagon. He'd been watching quietly, his broad shoulders leaning against a post, his face half hidden under the brim of a gray hat. His features were rough, like the cliffs that loomed over Willow Creek, hard lines softened by years of sun and wind. He moved toward her with a slow, deliberate stride, his boots silent on the packed earth. He didn't look at her with pity or scorn, but with a steady gaze that seemed to see her, not just the spectacle she'd become. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked, his voice low and even, like the rumble of a distant storm. Eleanor shook her head, her lips trembling. "I don't know where to go now. I gave up everything to come here." The man nodded, as if her words carried a weight he understood without needing to ask more. "Name's Caleb Holt," he said. "I've got a place a few miles out. Run a small ranch, some cattle, a couple of horses. It's not much, but it's mine. You can come with me if you need a place to rest. No need to decide anything today." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any hint of deceit. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." Caleb shrugged, his expression unchanging. Some folks need help. That's reason enough. Eleanor glanced back at the dirt road where Samuel and his friends had disappeared, their laughter still ringing in her ears. The ache in her chest was raw, a wound that hadn't yet stopped bleeding. She nodded, her shoulders sagging. All right. Caleb reached for her valise, his hand brushing hers briefly as he took it. Come on, he said. Let's get you somewhere quiet. They walked to his wagon, parked under a gnarled cottonwood tree. He offered his hand to help her up, and she took it. Surprised by the warmth and steadiness of his grip, she settled onto the wooden bench beside him, the valise at her feet, as he flicked the reins and the horses pulled them away from the station. The town of Willow Creek shrank behind them, the train's smoke a faint smudge against the sky. The ranch sat 6 miles west, nestled in a shallow valley where the grass grew thick and wild. The house was a low, sturdy structure with a shingle roof and a chimney puffing faint gray smoke. A barn stood nearby, its red paint peeling, but its frame solid. A few chickens scratched in the yard, and a doga scruffy mutt with one ear half-cocked trotted over to sniff at Eleanor's skirts. As she stepped down, Caleb carried her valise to the porch, the boards creaking under his weight. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and coffee, with a faint tang of leather. A rough-hewn table sat in the center of the main room, flanked by 2 chairs. A cast-iron stove glowed in the corner, and a single window let in slants of golden light. You can stay in the back room, Caleb said, setting her valise near the door. It was my brother's before he moved to Cheyenne. It's yours as long as you need it. Eleanor hesitated, her hands smoothing the front of her dress. Are you sure? I don't want to impose. I wouldn't offer if I didn't mean it, he said simply. She nodded and moved toward the room, her steps slow and heavy. The space was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a washstand, and a single chair. She sat on the edge of the bed, the springs creaking under her weight, and let the tears come. They were silent at first, then deep and shuddering, carrying the weight of betrayal and the fear of a future she could no longer see. Outside the door, Caleb paused, his shadow lingering in the hallway. He didn't knock or speak, just stood there, arms crossed, listening to the sound of her grief. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table, a pot of bean soup steaming between them. Caleb ladled a portion into a chipped bowl and passed it to her. They ate in silence, the only sounds the clink of spoons and the crackle of the fire. Eleanor's eyes were red, but she kept her chin up, determined not to let her shame define her. After supper, she helped clear the table, drying the dishes with a rag as Caleb washed. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice steady now. Being kind to me, I mean. He looked at her, his eyes clear and unflinching. Because you didn't deserve what happened back there. No one does. The days that followed were quiet but purposeful. Eleanor found small ways to make herself useful, sweeping the porch, feeding the chickens, mending a tear in one of Caleb's work shirts. He showed her how to check the horse's hooves for stones and how to spot the shift in the clouds that signaled rain. They spoke little, but the silence between them was comfortable, not heavy with expectation. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, they sat on the porch, the air cool against their skin. Eleanor's hands rested in her lap, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. You saw me crying that day, she said softly, her eyes fixed on the fading light. And you didn't turn away. No, Caleb said, his voice as steady as the land around them. She looked at him then, her gaze searching. I think I needed someone to stay. He met her eyes, his expression unchanging. I'm not going anywhere. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of sage and earth. Caleb reached out, his hand brushing hers lightly, and she didn't pull away. They sat like that as the stars began to prick the sky, the quiet between them saying more than words ever could. The weeks turned into a rhythm of work and rest. Eleanor learned the land's small secrets, the way the creek ran faster after a storm, the way the barn cat curled up in the hayloft when the nights grew cool. Caleb was a man of few words, but his actions spoke of a quiet strength. He fixed a loose board on the porch without being asked, left a bucket of water within her reach each morning, and once brought her a handful of wildflowers he'd picked while checking the fences. One morning, as they walked to the pasture to check on a limping calf, Eleanor kept pace beside him. her boots sinking into the soft earth. The calf, a small black and white creature, stood near its mother, favoring its left leg. Caleb crouched to inspect it, his hands gentle but sure. "Caught it on something sharp, maybe wire," he said, running his fingers along the calf's leg. "It'll heal, but I'll need to keep an eye on it." Eleanor leaned against the fence, the wood rough against her back. "Do you ever think about leaving this place?" she asked. He stood, dusting his hands. "Thought about it once. Had a chance to join a cattle drive to Denver. But my mother needed me here after my father passed. Never felt right to leave after that." "What happened to her?" Eleanor asked, her voice soft. "Died of fever when I was 20. Left me the ranch. I've been holding it together since." She nodded, her eyes tracing the horizon. "I was promised to someone before Samuel. Back in Pennsylvania. He was a blacksmith, kind at first, but he drank too much, and when he did, his hands weren't kind anymore. I broke it off, left home to start over. My father said I was foolish to think I could find something better." Caleb's eyes met hers, steady and unjudging. "You weren't foolish. You were brave." She looked away, her throat tight. "Doesn't always feel like it." They walked back to the house in silence, the calf's soft bleats fading behind them. Inside, Eleanor washed her hands at the basin while Caleb stoked the fire. She noticed a scar on his wrist, a jagged line that stood out against his tan skin. "What's that from?" she asked. "Old fight with a fence post," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Lost the fight, but kept the post." She smiled back, the first real smile she'd felt in weeks. "You always this quiet." "Don't know any other way," he said, pouring water into the kettle. "But you're welcome to stay as long as you need, Eleanor. No strings." Her hands stilled on the dishcloth. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," he said, his voice firm. "You're someone who got hurt. That doesn't make you less." She held his gaze, her heart unsteady but warm. "Thank you, Caleb." The fire crackled, and outside, the wind whispered through the grass. They stood there, not speaking, but the space between them felt alive with possibility. By early July, the ranch was alive with the hum of summer. The cottonwoods along the creek shimmered in the breeze, their leaves catching the light like 1,000 tiny mirrors. Eleanor stood in the shallow water, her skirts tied up, scrubbing Caleb's shirts against a washboard. The work was hard but grounding, each stroke a way to anchor herself to this new place. She glanced up to see Caleb in the distance, leading a pair of horses toward the corral. His movements were steady, unhurried, like a man who knew the land as well as his own hands. She'd watched him the day before, calming a skittish colt with nothing but a soft voice and a steady hand. No spurs, no harsh words, just patience. It was a kind of strength she hadn't seen in the men back east, and it stirred something in her she wasn't ready to name. When the washing was done, she spread the clothes over a fallen log to dry and sat on the creek bank, her feet trailing in the cool water. The sound of boots on grass made her turn. Caleb approached, leading a gentle bay mare. "Thought you might like to try riding," he said, holding the reins loosely. Eleanor blinked. "I've never ridden. Not properly." "She's steady," he said. "Won't give you trouble. I'll be right beside you." She hesitated, then stood, brushing her hands on her apron. He helped her into the saddle, his hands firm but gentle as he adjusted her grip on the reins. The mare shifted but didn't bolt, and Eleanor's heart raced as she found her balance. Caleb mounted his own horse and led them along the creek, the water glinting in the sunlight. "Do you ever think about marrying?" she asked after a while, her voice almost lost in the hum of insects. He glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Used to, when I was younger, but the ranch always needed me more. Now I don't know. Feels like the quiet's waiting for something." They rode in silence for a while, the horses' hooves soft against the earth. At a low ridge, they dismounted, and Eleanor walked a few steps ahead, the wind tugging at her hair. The valley stretched out before them, vast and unbroken, and for the first time, she felt like she could breathe without the weight of her past pressing down. "I thought I'd be married by now," she said, her voice soft but clear. "A home, children, a man who knew me, really knew me, not just what I could do for him." Caleb stood beside her, his head in his hand. "I see you, Eleanor," he said. "I saw you that first day, and I haven't stopped." She turned to him, her eyes searching his. I'm scared to hope again. Then we'll take it slow, he said. Build it together, one step at a time. She reached for his hand, and he took it, their fingers fitting together like they'd always belonged. They stood there as the sun sank lower, the world around them quiet and full of promise. The days grew warmer, and Eleanor found herself settling into the rhythm of the ranch. She planted a small garden near the house, turning the soil with a borrowed spade. Caleb watched her one afternoon, leaning against the fence. You've got a way with the land, he said. My mother taught me, she said, wiping sweat from her brow. She said idle ground was a sin. He nodded, stepping closer. What'll you plant? Carrots, beans, maybe some herbs. Something to make the place feel like home. He looked at her then, his eyes soft. You're already doing that. That night, they sat by the fire, Eleanor mending a pair of Caleb's trousers while he sharpened a knife. The silence was warm, not heavy, and when she looked up, she caught him watching her. What? She asked, a smile tugging at her lips. Just thinking, he said. If you ever want more than this, more than quiet, and a roof, I'm here. She set the needle down, her heart full. I'm starting to think this might be enough. Their hands brushed as she passed him the mended trousers, and neither of them pulled away. The firelight danced across the room, and for the first time, Eleanor felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. As July draped its heavy warmth over the Wyoming Valley, Eleanor Grayson's days at Caleb Holt's ranch settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar, like a song she'd heard once and was learning to hum. The cottonwoods along the creek shimmered under the relentless sun, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind. Eleanor stood in the garden she'd carved out near the house, her hands caked with earth as she pressed bean seeds into the soil. The work was a tether, grounding her in a place that had begun to feel less like a refuge and more like a home. Yet, the shadow of Samuel Carver's laughter still lingered, a bruise on her heart that ached when she let her thoughts wander too far. Caleb was a constant presence, not overbearing but steady, like the hills that cradled the ranch. He moved through his tasks with a quiet precision, mending fences, checking the cattle, oiling the barn's creaky hinges. Eleanor watched him sometimes, noting the way his hands worked with care. Whether guiding a horse or stacking firewood, there was a strength in him that didn't demand attention, and it stirred something in her she wasn't ready to name. But each evening, when they sat on the porch as the sky bled into dusk, she felt the distance between them shrink, their silences growing warmer, more intimate. One morning, as Eleanor gathered eggs from the henhouse, the straw crunching under her boots, she heard the clatter of hooves on the dirt road. She straightened, shielding her eyes against the sun, and saw a rider Apro-Achinga man in a dark coat, his hat low, leading a second horse laden with packs. Caleb emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his face unreadable as the rider dismounted. Morning, Caleb, the man called, his voice rough but friendly. Got some supplies from town. Thought I'd check in. John, Caleb said, nodding. Good to see you. Coffee's on if you want it. The man, John Tully, tipped his hat to Eleanor as she approached, her basket heavy with eggs. Ma'am, he said, his eyes curious but kind. Didn't know you had company. She's staying on, Caleb said simply, his tone leaving no room for questions. This is Eleanor Grayson. John nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before turning back to Caleb. Heard some talk in town. That Carver fella's been flapping his jaw about a woman who came west on a fool's errand. Didn't sit right with me. Eleanor's stomach tightened, the eggs in her basket suddenly feeling heavier. She kept her eyes on the ground, the memory of Samuel's mockery flooding back. Caleb's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. Folks talk. Doesn't make it true. John grunted, unloading a sack of flour from the pack horse. Just thought you should know. He's got a mean streak, that one. Been stirring trouble at the saloon, too. Caleb took the sack, his movements deliberate. Appreciate the heads up. Stay for supper? John shook his head. Got to get back before dark, but I'll swing by next week. He tipped his hat again to Eleanor, mounted his horse, and rode off, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. Eleanor set the basket down, her hands trembling slightly. He was talking about me, wasn't he? Caleb met her eyes, his gaze steady. Doesn't matter what he says. You're here now. That's what counts. She nodded, but the words didn't erase the sting. That evening, as they ate cornbread and stood by the fire, she found herself quieter than usual. Her thoughts tangled in the past. Caleb didn't press her, but when she rose to clear the plates, he caught her hand gently. "You're not what he said you are," he told her. "Not to me." Her throat tightened, and she squeezed his hand before letting go. "I'm trying to believe that." The days grew hotter, the air thick with the hum of cicadas. Eleanor threw herself into the work of the ranch, finding solace in the routine. She learned to mend a harness, to spot the signs of a sick calf, to bake bread in the finicky cast-iron stove. Caleb taught her how to ride properly, guiding her hands on the reins until she could sit the mare with confidence. Their rides along the creek became a ritual, the horse's hooves soft against the earth, the silence between them a language of its own. One afternoon, as they returned from checking the fences, Eleanor noticed a figure waiting near the house. It was a woman older, with gray hair pulled tight under a bonnet, her hands clasped in front of her. Caleb dismounted, his expression guarded. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, tipping his hat. "What brings you out?" The woman's eyes flicked to Eleanor, sharp but not unkind. "Heard you had a guest. Thought I'd see for myself. I'm Martha Hargrove, run the boarding house in town." Eleanor dismounted, smoothing her skirt. "Eleanor Grayson. Pleased to meet you." Martha's gaze softened slightly. "Folks in town are talking, Miss Grayson, about you and that Carver boy. I don't put much stock in gossip, but I wanted to warn you. He's been drinking more than usual, and he's not kind when he's in his cups." Eleanor's chest tightened, but she nodded. "Thank you for telling me." Martha turned to Caleb. "You keep an eye on her, Caleb Holt. This valley's no place for a woman alone." "I'm not alone," Eleanor said, her voice quieter than she intended. Martha studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good. You need anything, you come to me." She climbed into her wagon and drove off, the wheels creaking as they rolled down the road. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The memory of Samuel's laughter mixed with the warnings from John and Martha, stirring a restless fear. She sat by the window, her shawl wrapped tight, watching the moon cast shadows across the yard. Caleb found her there, his footsteps soft on the floorboards. "Can't sleep?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. She shook her head. "I keep thinking about what they said. About Samuel. What if he comes here?" Caleb's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "He won't. And if he does, he'll answer to me." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "You don't have to fight my battles, Caleb." "I'm not," he said. "I'm standing beside you." "That's different." She nodded, her throat tight. He crossed the room and sat beside her, not touching but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. They sat in silence, the night stretching out around them, and for the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt the weight of her fear ease, if only a little. By mid-August, the garden was thriving, the bean vines curling up the stakes Eleanor had driven into the soil. She spent her mornings tending the plants, her hands steady as she pulled weeds or watered the rows. Caleb watched her sometimes, leaning against the fence with a faint smile. "You've got a gift for this," he said one day, as she dusted dirt from her hands. "My mother used to say a garden's like a promise," she replied. "You put in the work, and it gives back." He nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "You're making this place more than it was." She looked at him, her heart unsteady. "I'm trying to make it mine, too." That evening, they sat on the porch, the air cooling as the sun sank low. Eleanor's hands rested in her lap, her fingers tracing the edge of her apron. "I was engaged once," she said suddenly, her voice soft. "Before Samuel. Back in Pennsylvania. He was a school teacher, gentle when he wanted to be. But he had a temper, and I saw it too late. I left before it could break me." Caleb's eyes met hers, steady as always. "You did what you had to. That's strength, not weakness." She looked away, her throat tight. "I keep wondering if I'm meant to be alone. If that's why I keep ending up here, starting over." He reached for her hand, his touch light but sure. "You're not alone, Eleanor. Not anymore." She held his gaze, her heart pounding. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of sage and earth, and for the first time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she could build something new. The weeks passed, and the ranch became a haven. Eleanor learned to read the sky for storms, to mend a saddle, to laugh at the way the barn cat chased its tail. Caleb was a steady presence, his quiet strength a contrast to the men who had hurt her. But the specter of Samuel Carver lingered, a shadow that crept into her thoughts when she least expected it. One morning, as Eleanor hung laundry on the line, she heard the sound of hooves again. She turned, expecting John Tully or another neighbor. But her blood ran cold when she saw Samuel Carver riding up the path, his face flushed and his eyes glassy. He reined in his horse, swaying slightly in the saddle. "Well, look at you," he slurred, his voice loud enough to carry across the yard. "Found yourself a new man already? Didn't take you long." Eleanor's heart pounded, but she stood her ground, the wet shirt in her hands dripping onto her boots. "You need to leave, Samuel." He laughed, the sound harsh and unsteady. "You think you can just waltz in here and play house? I made you a laughing stock in town, and I can do it again." Caleb stepped out of the barn, his face calm but his eyes hard. "You heard her," he said, his voice low. "Get off my land." Samuel sneered, leaning forward in the saddle. "What's she to you, Holt? Charity case? Or you just like picking up my scraps?" Caleb's hands clenched, but he didn't move. "Last chance, Carver. Right out." Samuel hesitated, his eyes flicking between Caleb and Eleanor. Then he spat on the ground and turned his horse, muttering curses as he rode off. Eleanor's knees felt weak, but she kept her chin up, refusing to let him see her break. Caleb crossed the yard to her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "You all right?" She nodded, though her voice trembled. "I didn't think he'd come here." "He won't again," Caleb said, his tone final. "Not if he knows what's good for him." That night, Eleanor sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Caleb sat across from her, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes. "I don't want you to fight him," she said quietly. "Not for me." "I won't," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "But I'll protect what's mine, and you're part of that now." She looked at him, her heart full. "I don't know what I did to deserve you." He set the knife down, his voice soft. "You didn't have to do anything. You just had to be you." The fire crackled, and outside, the night was still. Eleanor reached for his hand, and he took it, their fingers lacing together. The fear was still there, but it was smaller now, overshadowed by the warmth of the life they were building, one quiet moment at a time. As September approached, the air grew crisper, the grass in the valley turning golden under the fading sun. Eleanor stood in the garden, harvesting the first of the beans, her basket heavy with the fruits of her labor. Caleb joined her, carrying a spade to turn the soil for the next planting. They worked in tandem, their movements easy and familiar. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked, brushing dirt from her hands. He paused, leaning on the spade. "Every day. But I'm not in a hurry. We've got time." She smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in months. "I think I like that." They stood together in the garden, the wind carrying the scent of earth and possibility. The ranch was no longer just Caleb's, it was theirs, a shared space where broken promises could give way to something stronger, something real. With the arrival of September, the Wyoming Valley settled into a golden hush, the air sharp with the promise of autumn. Eleanor Grayson's life at Caleb Holt's ranch had taken on a quiet permanence, each day weaving her deeper into the fabric of the place. The garden she'd tended through the summer now brimmed with beans, onions, and herbs, their roots anchoring her to the land as much as to the man who shared it with her. The memory of Samuel Carver's cruelty still lingered, but it was fading, like a bruise that no longer ached unless pressed. In its place grew something new, a trust, a partnership, a love that didn't need to shout to be felt. Caleb remained a steady presence, his quiet strength a constant in Eleanor's days. They worked side by side, their routines a dance of shared purpose, mending fences, tending the cattle, sitting on the porch as the stars emerged. But the specter of Samuel's visit in August hung over them, a reminder that the world beyond the ranch could still reach in and wound. Eleanor felt it most in the quiet moments, when the wind carried the distant sound of hooves or the creak of a wagon, making her heart skip with the fear that he might return. One crisp morning, as Eleanor swept the porch, she noticed a letter tucked under the door. Her hands stilled, the broom leaning against the railing. The envelope was plain, addressed to her in a scrawl she didn't recognize. She carried it inside, her fingers trembling as she broke the seal. The words were brief, written in a hurried hand. I know what you're doing out there. You think you can hide, but I see you. Stay out of my way. It was unsigned, but she knew it was from Samuel. Caleb found her at the kitchen table, the letter open in front of her. What's that? He asked, his voice calm but edged with concern. She slid it toward him, her throat tight. It came this morning. I think it's from him. He read it, his jaw tightening. He's trying to scare you. He's got no claim on you, Eleanor. I know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I'm tired of being afraid. He reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. You don't have to face this alone. We'll handle it together. That afternoon, Caleb rode into Willow Creek to speak with the sheriff, a grizzled man named Amos Reed who'd known Caleb's father. Eleanor stayed behind, trying to lose herself in the rhythm of her chores. But the letter's words echoed in her mind. She was hanging laundry when she heard hooves again, and her heart leapt to her throat. But it was only Martha Hargrove, the boarding house owner, driving her wagon up the path. Eleanor, Martha called, climbing down. I heard about Carver causing trouble again. You all right? Eleanor nodded, forcing a smile. I'm managing. Caleb's gone to town to see the sheriff. Martha's eyes softened. Good. That boy's got no business harassing you. But you be careful. He's been drinking heavy, and he's got friends who aren't much better. Thank you, Martha, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the knot in her chest. Martha stayed for coffee, her presence a comfort, and when she left, Eleanor felt a resolve hardening within her. She wouldn't let Samuel's cruelty define her. She'd come too far, built too much, to let him tear it down. Caleb returned as the sun dipped low, his face grim but determined. Sheriff's keeping an eye on Carver, he said, hanging his hat by the door. Told him about the letter. He'll ride out if there's trouble. Eleanor nodded, her hands busy with supper preparations. I don't want you getting hurt because of me. I won't, he said, his voice firm. But I'm not letting him near you again. That night, they sat by the fire, the letter tucked away in a drawer. Eleanor read aloud from a book of poetry she'd found in Caleb's trunk, her voice soft and steady. When she finished, he looked at her, his eyes warm. You've got a way with words, he said. Makes me think there's more to you than you let on. She smiled, closing the book. I used to teach back in Pennsylvania. Just a little, helping the younger children with their letters. I miss it sometimes. You could teach again, he said. There's a school in town. They're always needing help. She looked at him, surprised. You think I could? I know you could, he said. You've got more strength than you give yourself credit for. The idea took root, and the next week, Eleanor rode into town with Caleb to meet Mrs. Ellison, the school teacher. The woman was kind but overworked, her eyes lighting up when Eleanor offered to help with reading lessons. We'd be grateful, Mrs. Ellison said. The children need someone patient, and I can see you've got that in spades. By October, Eleanor was spending 2 mornings a week at the schoolhouse, her voice steady as she guided the children through their primers. The work gave her purpose, a way to give back to the community that had begun to feel like hers. But the shadow of Samuel Carver remained. One afternoon, as she walked home from the schoolhouse, she saw him across the street, leaning against a post outside the saloon. His eyes locked on hers, and he smirked, raising a bottle in a mocking toast. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding, and didn't stop until she reached the ranch. Caleb was in the barn, pitching hay, and she told him what happened, her voice shaking. He set the pitchfork down, his face hard. He's pushing his luck, he said. I'll ride into town tomorrow. Make it clear he needs to stay away. No, Eleanor said, her voice firm. I need to face him. I can't keep hiding. Caleb studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but I'm coming with you. The next day, they rode into Willow Creek together, the air crisp and the sky a pale blue. They found Samuel outside the saloon, his face flushed from drink. Eleanor dismounted, her hands steady despite the fear in her chest. Samuel, she said, her voice clear. You need to stop this. The letters, the threats. I'm not yours to torment. He laughed, but it was unsteady, his eyes darting to Caleb, who stood a few paces behind her, his presence a quiet warning. You think you're something now, don't you? Samuel sneered. Living out there with him, Playing house? I'm building a life, Eleanor said, her voice unwavering. Something you'll never understand. Leave me be, or the sheriff will hear about it. Samuel's smirk faltered, and for a moment, he looked small, diminished. He muttered something under his breath and turned away, disappearing into the saloon. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, and Caleb's hand found hers. Steady and warm. You did good, he said as they rode back to the ranch. I needed to, she said. For me. The months passed, and the ranch became a true home. Eleanor's mornings at the schoolhouse brought her joy. The children's eager faces a reminder of what she could offer. Caleb began building a small addition to the house, a room for the future they hadn't yet named, but both felt growing between them. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Eleanor's head resting against his shoulder, she felt a flutter in her stomach, a secret she'd been carrying for weeks. Caleb, she said softly, her hand finding his. I'm with child. He turned to her, his eyes wide, then soft. You sure? She nodded, her smile trembling. For months, I think. I wanted to be certain before I told you. He pulled her close, his arms strong and sure. We'll make it work. Everything's going to be ready. The winter came gentle that year, the snow dusting the valley like powdered sugar. Eleanor's belly grew round, and Caleb added a railing to the porch steps, his hands careful and precise. They read by lamplight each night, her head on his shoulder, his hand resting on the curve of her stomach. The future felt real now, not a dream, but a promise they were building together. One evening, as the fire burned low, Eleanor looked at him. Why did you stay that day at the station? You could have walked away. He set down the knife he'd been whittling with, his eyes meeting hers. You looked like you were holding on by a thread, and I knew what that felt like. I couldn't leave you there. She reached for his hand, her voice soft. You've given me a life I never thought I'd have. We gave it to each other, he said, his thumb brushing her knuckles. Their daughter arrived in April, just as the wildflowers began to bloom along the creek. The labor was long, but Martha Hargrove was there, her hands steady as she guided Eleanor through the pain. Caleb sat behind her, his arms a brace against her trembling. At dawn, their daughter cried out, her tiny fists waving in the air. They named her Abigail, after Eleanor's grandmother, and wrapped her in a quilt made from scraps of their old clothes. She's ours, Caleb said, his voice thick as he kissed Eleanor's forehead. The years that followed were full of small, steady moments. The garden flourished, the ranch grew, and Abigail learned to walk in the grass, her laughter a song that filled the valley. Samuel Carver faded from their lives, his name rarely mentioned, his shadow no longer a threat. The townsfolk of Willow Creek welcomed Eleanor as one of their own, her work at the schoolhouse earning their respect. One evening, as the first frost of another autumn settled over the ranch, Eleanor stood at the window, watching the cattle huddle near the fence. Caleb came up behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. I was never meant to come here, she said softly, but I was meant to find you. He kissed the top of her head, and I was meant to be found. They stood together, the fire casting a warm glow across the room. The life they'd built was not perfect, but it was thirst-forged from broken promises, quiet kindness, and a love that grew stronger with every shared day. Abigail slept in her cradle, the ranch hummed with life, and Eleanor knew that every step from that train platform had led her to this moment, to a home that was more than she'd ever dared hope for. Thank you for reading A Promise Broken, A Life Found. This story explores themes of betrayal, resilience, and the power of kindness in the face of injustice. What are your thoughts on how Eleanor and Caleb overcame the violence and cruelty of Samuel's actions? Should they have confronted him more forcefully, or was their quiet strength the better path? Share your opinions in the comments below. I would love to hear your perspective on navigating injustice in life.